Hello, I'm John Butler, Investment Director at Fortune and Freedom, and I'm joined today by my colleague Nick Hubble, an editor at Fortune and Freedom, who wrote an article recently, Has the Submarine Energy War Already Begun? This article, provocatively titled as it is, has generated much discussion in our social media channels. It is provocative and it's absolutely fascinating, in my opinion, drawing as it does on not only recent developments, but an interesting pattern of developments we've seen now for several years, and which point towards some possibly disturbing, concerning developments coming in our future. So please welcome Nick Hubble to our interview today. Let me start by asking you, if you could please ever so briefly describe the key point that you make in this article that you think has stirred up such a discussion.
I hate to disappoint all the submarine enthusiasts out there. This is an energy story. It's all about what is happening underneath the oceans right now. The basic idea in its simplest form is that just as gas relies on these subsea gas lines going, for example, the Nord Stream 2 project, we have now this renewable energy system that is very reliant on subsea power cables, both connecting the offshore wind farms, but also the connections between the two different countries, such as France and Ireland, or the UK and Northern Ireland, all these different countries that have been connected by subsea power cables. That's all necessary in order to shift the burden of intermittent energy around. But of course, it exposes countries to the very same threat that someone is going to cut their cables. And it turns out that is rather a common phenomenon.
Well, indeed. And let's face it, here in Great Britain, a large island, you live in Japan, a group of large islands, we would seem rather disproportionately exposed to this sort of subsea warfare risk, wouldn't we?
That's definitely true. But a lot of countries are using this whole subsea cable system in order to avoid having to build the same energy infrastructure on land. There's lots of resistance to these high voltage cables going across farms and scenic routes and so on and so forth. So even the countries that are not really reliant on their coastlines for transmitting these energies between islands still have the same risk. It's especially true in the UK because we are almost encircled by these projects where these high voltage direct current cables are going to be, or even are already. So we're especially vulnerable. And of course, we've got that proximity to the power, the world power that is supposedly, of course, cutting all of these energy cables. So we're especially vulnerable, yes, but I think this really is a global issue.
One thing that's interesting, though, is you've mentioned Nord Stream, which obviously was a gas pipeline, and we have the electrical lines that connect us to the French power grid, for example, so we can draw on continental power. But you dispel this myth that somehow by the UK developing its own wind and solar and other renewable capacity, that somehow that would solve the problem. And you point out that, in fact, in some ways, additional reliance on renewable sources of energy might, in fact, make the UK more vulnerable to this sort of danger. Could you explain?
Yeah, I was reading only today that the Labour government was saying renewables are wonderful because they're homegrown energy. It's all about energy independence. But of course, you could have that with oil and gas as well. I'm adding another reason, another way in which renewables are actually not that energy secure. And it's this reliance on those cables, which are easily cut. And just as Nord Stream 2 the sabotage was not attributed to any particular government, at least not publicly by our security services, the same could happen to our energy cables, and does happen to energy cables and also to telecoms cables quite often around the world. So it's the same story repeating, or at least it has the potential to become the same story as Nord Stream 2.
Well, then, I mean, it doesn't seem like a very nice situation to be in, that is, to have this degree of dependence. What presumably should or could the UK or other countries that are concerned, I mean, what might they try to do about it? I mean, is there some sort of simple fix here, or is it much more complicated than that?
Well, there's all sorts of issues with trying to complete the energy transition as it's envisioned now. One of them is that it requires this vast energy infrastructure grid, being able to move electricity very long distances, being able to deal with intermittent power. One way of dealing with all this is to not focus on intermittent power, which would mean not requiring all that storage, not requiring all that infrastructure. The obvious answer being, of course, nuclear power, which is also low emissions or no emissions. So that is the obvious way to go. Especially, I would suggest using small modular reactors because they can be built where the demand actually is for the energy, which minimizes the amount of energy infrastructure and storage you need. But I think that's a whole new story here because the government has decided, and governments all around the world have decided that we're doing this whole renewable energy thing regardless. I think we've already committed to that. And all around the world, these energy infrastructure projects are rolling out, literally. There's all sorts of subsea cables being built. So even if you have renewable energy as a relatively small part of your electricity grid, you still need all of that electricity infrastructure. You still need all of those cables. All of that is necessary. Even if you have a mix of nuclear renewables, you still need that vast grid. You still need those cables. So you're not really getting anywhere. So a good example of this right now is that we've just had the environmental approval of a cable between Australia and Singapore. So Singapore is going to be reliant on Australian sunshine for a large chunk of its energy potentially in the future. And if that cable gets cut, that's like being able to pull a plug on the Singapore electricity system because it's a big enough share of their electricity. I can't remember what it was off the top of my head, but it's a big enough share that it's going to require potentially imposing blackouts on parts of Singapore, on certain industries within Singapore. So it doesn't really matter so much what we might want to do about this. We're going to be stuck in this situation because we've overcommitted ourselves to renewables into the infrastructure already.
Well, it seems then that we're really in something of a dilemma because we have invested heavily, as you say, in renewables. They haven't really delivered on their promises. I mean, they might someday, but they certainly haven't yet. However, in the meantime, we've not been investing enough just in maintaining the capacity of more traditional energy provision for our economy. And that, of course, means that energy prices go up. It means energy security and flexibility goes down. And so now we've got this additional risk that no one's really even been talking about, which could also compromise the whole thing. And it would seem to me that when problems become so acute that they simply cannot be politically ignored anymore, they finally do get dealt with. But of course, if the problem has built up sufficiently in the meantime, it becomes that much more difficult, that much more expensive to fix. Now, that money to fix it, of course, we know where that's going to come from, right? It's going to come from taxes, and it's going to come from borrowing, which is effectively future taxation. But someone benefits from that, right? Someone is actually going to benefit from this because they're going to be on the receiving end of this, are they not?
Yeah, so I was interviewing a bit of a whistleblower today for an upcoming issue of the Fleet Street letter, and he made a really salient point which answers your question really beautifully, which is that Western countries privatize their energy systems to varying degrees in various ways. You can debate all of that to what extent. But the point is that electricity systems went from being a government-provided service that, industries could rely on there being enough electricity for whatever they wanted to do. We sustained that high level of investment over time, and then we privatized it. And what this whistleblower argues has happened is that over the last few years since privatization, investment in sustaining all of that infrastructure fell away dramatically. And what we've got happening now, is exactly what you said, is this lack of investment is now catching up with us. And so we've got the energy transition to renewables, we've got the electrification of everything, and we've got this pent-up lack of investment in the capacity to deal with those problems, which means if someone's going to try and fix this problem, i.e. the taxpayer and the government, that's going to require an absolutely shocking and terrifying and vast amount of electricity because they've got to deal with the intermittency of renewables. They've got to deal with issues such as dirty power, which is fluctuations in voltage and frequency. They've got to deal with issues like the one we're talking about here, which is trying to keep those cables, so subsea cables, secure. They've got to deal with it's just a backlog of investment everywhere across the board. And the amount that this has grown to is getting so vast that no one's going to want to acknowledge this problem. Meanwhile, the actual energy users, all of these industries, especially the ones that are supposedly going to be electrifying, are going to discover that the electricity is basically not fit for purpose. It's no longer able, because of all these challenges, to do what we just presume. I mean, the idea that an electricity system is not going to provide us with what we need is sort of slightly odd to people, right? Because we're so used to that not being the case. Maybe very large businesses understand that they need to give notice to the electricity grid operator that there's going to be a large boom in electricity demand if we build this large factory or whatever it might be. But we're not used to that being an actual challenge. We're used to just having whatever it is that we might decide we need for our economy and our own personal demand. So it's accumulating on the demand side, the supply side, on the investment in the infrastructure, on the quality of energy into one very large shock.
Well, it's interesting what you say about how you've got kind of the worst of both worlds. That is, you have centralization, but the effectiveness of the power available through that centralization is being compromised by, again, this term that you just mentioned, you used, dirty electricity, right? Dirty energy, which is voltage that fluctuates or behaves in such a way that it actually damages circuitry. It actually damages electrical components in ways that, to the untrained eye, of course, cannot be seen or understood until all of a sudden, the screen goes blank, the light goes out, whatever it is. It's kind of like the water utilities polluting rivers and streams, even though they're nominally doing what they're supposed to be doing. There's this dirty side effect to what they're doing, which does have a real cost that does build up over time, that does eventually need to be dealt with. And beyond a certain point, businesses, for households for that matter, but certainly businesses who depend on clean water or clean electricity will have to take things into their own hands. For example, a hospital or some critical business that absolutely cannot allow the power to go down is naturally required to have some sort of diesel generating unit as a backup. But you're going to need something more than a backup. If it becomes a chronic problem, it's no longer a backup now, is it? And so you're going to see decentralized activity, behavior, looking for effective solutions to this going forward. Are you not?
That's right. I remember watching a documentary, I think it was by Deutsche Welle TV, about all of these small business owners in Germany. I remember vets and tool shop owners and all sorts of other people. There'd been this boom in such people buying diesel generators because they no longer trusted the energy system to provide the power they need. Obviously, if you're a vet and you're doing a surgery on a cat, you can't have the power turn off halfway through. And so they'd all been buying these diesel generators. But the thing I really want to emphasize here is how long it takes to fix these issues, right? Energy investment, energy generation, all these things, it's almost measured in decades, right? So if we've made a big mistake here, which is what we're claiming, and if we're right, then there's going to be at least about a decade of tumult and chaos and issues. And then the question is, what spits out the other end as the solution? It's possible that they nationalize all the electricity generation and grid and so on and so forth. It's possible you get this decentralization, which is what you and I favor, and we've written about in the Fleet Street letter. There's a couple of other solutions out there. But the point is that we're in for a rough ride in the meantime.
Well, as we at Fortune and Freedom always say, the world is certainly an imperfect place. There's always money to be made, however, by finding solutions to those problems. Sadly, we also have governments, however, that are frequently the source of problems themselves. And yet, here too, there is money to be made by finding solutions to the problems created by our own governments. And we're living through an age where arguably the problems created by governments are the larger share of the problems that we here in the modern world are dealing with. Look, Nick, it's always great to hear your thoughts. I always enjoy these discussions with you. I'm sure our viewers do too. Oh, and speaking of our viewers, please, if you've enjoyed this discussion, if you've enjoyed our past discussions here at Fortune and Freedom, it really would help if you would subscribe to our YouTube channel. So if you could, after watching this video, hit the subscribe button. That would be greatly appreciated. And we look forward to joining you for another discussion on hopefully an equally fascinating topic again soon. Thank you very much for watching today.